Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Building Codes and the Future of Electric Vehicles webinar. I am Simbiat Yusuf. I'm the Communications Associate with Fourth, and I will be moderating this this webinar. If you could please submit all questions via the attendee chat, and we will get to all of your questions at the end of the presentation. The button is on the top left corner of your screen. It is called the attendee chat button, and just ask your questions throughout the webinar and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. And with that, I would like to do a little introduction on Fourth and who we are. Fourth is a nonprofit trade association advocating for electric, shared, and smart mobility. We work in 4 focus areas: innovation, demonstration projects, advocacy, and engagement. We are advancing electric, shared, and smart transportation throughout not just the Pacific Northwest, but with our 160 member companies and organizations. The roadmap 12 is live. If you haven't registered, please register as soon as possible. It is coming up June 18th through the 19th, and we have a lot of side events that will happen and receptions as well. If you're not able to attend the full roadmap conference, we have reception-only tickets. If you want to mingle with your fellow industry folks, this is a nice opportunity to do so. Today, we have our fourth program manager, Eric Huang, and our guest speakers, ED Pike, who is the technical lead at Energy Solutions, and Hannah Goldsmith, the Deputy Executive Director of California Electric Transportation Coalition. Today's webinar will explore how electric vehicles, EV-ready buildings can help overcome a critical barrier to EV adoption by facilitating electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the key roles of EV-ready buildings and the impact of EV adoption. And our speaker, Eric, serves as the program manager for Fourth. It promotes electric vehicle adoption. He focuses on building codes and policy that promotes EV readiness in residential and commercial building. He holds an MPA in public policy analysis and a Master of Science in environmental science in energy from Indiana University. And he is a proud nerd of clean transportation and cars. ED Pike is a senior engineer at Energy Solution. He is a licensed civil engineer with over 25 years of air quality and transportation research experience for government and private clients in areas such as plug-in electric vehicle policy and infrastructure and light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas standards. He currently leads the transportation business area at Energy Solutions, such as plug-in electric vehicles infrastructure, state, local, and national green building standards, the contribution of PEVs to zero net energy homes and fuel-efficient tires. He has previously worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the International Council of Clean Transportation. Hannah Goldsmith is the Deputy Executive Director of California Electric Transportation Coalition, a nonprofit association which supports and advocates for the transition to a zero-emission transportation future as a means to spur economic growth, fuel diversity, and energy independence, ensure clean air, and combat climate change. Anna primarily supports Cal ETC's legislative and regulatory efforts relating to zero-emission cars and goods and people movement technologies, as well as electric vehicle charging. Anna has been driving an electric car since April 2016 and currently drives a Bolt. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Eric, who is going to speak on EV readiness and building codes.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar on EB Readiness and Building Codes. My name is Eric Huang. I'm the program manager at Fourth, and my focus is on residential charging facilitation, especially in multi-unit dwellings where major barriers such as principal agent problem in the form of tenant versus landlord in obtaining charging continue to deter our consumers from EV adoption. What we want to achieve today is to give you, the audience, an introductory session on building codes and EV readiness, so you would have a better idea of what EV readiness means and what kind of building code language you should applicate for. Today, I'll be going over the introduction to building codes and give you a basic idea of why building codes matter in the backdrop of EV adoption. At the latter part of my presentation, I'll be introducing why we need building code language for EV readiness requirements. And after that, I'll the floor to the guest speakers from Energy Solutions and California Electric Transportation Coalition to give you more detailed recommendations and some updates on the current adoption status of EV building codes around the nation. So let's get started. First things first, what are building codes? So building codes are a collection of laws, regulations, ordinances adopted by a government legislative authority with the physical structure and health condition of buildings and building sites. So here there are two elements that we need to separate. One, first things first is that these codes are not laws before they are adopted by the government legislative authorities. So before they are adopted, they are model codes. And the purpose of these model codes is actually to protect the building's occupants' health, safety, and general welfare, and they're aiming to reduce potential hazards, lower construction costs, provide standards in construction, and contribute to community well-being by reducing waste or energy consumption. So before they're adopted, they are actually model codes. And who are the entities that develop these model codes? The popular entities out there are ICC, International Code Council, NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, American Society of Heating and Air Conditioning Engineers, and a lot more others out there that are actively producing model codes. And today, our feature organization is ICC, International Code Council. It is a member-focused association with over 64,000 members from different aspects of the society. And ICC has a total of 15 I codes that they have developed as model codes that are compatible with each other. The popular examples are down there, which are International Building Codes, International Residential Codes, and International Energy Conservation Codes. And in this graph, you can see is a demonstration of the overall development cycle of I codes for ICC, which shows that it's a quite meticulous process with hearings and comments, just like the rulemaking procedure for legislations and policies. And as mentioned above, model codes developed by these entities are not laws or regulations before being adopted by jurisdictions. So who adopt these building codes or model codes? It's the nations, states, and the provinces who have the authority or jurisdiction over these areas that will adopt these building codes developed by organizations like ACC according to the jurisdiction's own preference. So in the United States, states and local governments actually generally have a very large jurisdiction over the latitudes of what to adopt and how they would like to adopt these building codes or electric codes or even administrative permitting process. A quick example would be in the state of Oregon, where Oregon state does not allow municipalities to enact or enforce an ordinance that the state building code already provides for, unless given special permission. But in the state of California, a city like San Francisco can actually adopt amendments to make their California Cal Green building codes more stringent if they feel like to. And another aspect of building codes would be how often or what's the code cycle for building codes updates. For ICC, for International Code Council, the general cycle is 3 years, and within this 3 years, it's going to go through the entire cycle that we have just shown here in this slide. Within 3 years, it will go through submission of code changes. It will go through the public hearings, public comment collection, review, and also at the very end of the 3-year cycle, the new edition will be published. And because of the popularity of I codes within the United States, a lot of the US states actually have a general code cycle of 3 years as well. Examples would be in Oregon and Washington states, they update their building codes every 3 years as well. And here is a slide of IECC, the International Energy Council adoption status in the. This shows two things. Number one, IECC produced by ICC is very popular among U.S. states. Only 2 states in the United States that has not adopted IECC to be their energy conservation code. And another thing, and the second thing that it demonstrates is that states such as California and Indiana do have a very wide authority over what kind of code that they would like to adopt. And California and Indiana has chosen not to adopt IECC despite its popularity in the United States overall. So just to summarize building codes. Building codes are generally divided by sections such as building, electrical, mechanical, and plumbing, as demonstrated in the 15 I-codes products that's developed by ICC. And model codes developed by organizations like ICC are adopted by states, municipalities, and sometimes nations, depending on the specific subject that model code is providing for and the specific jurisdiction authority each level of the governance would have on that specific topic. And last but not least is that the ability of each level to create and enforce code varies widely depending on the state and locality. So if you want to really figure out what your state or what your municipality would have the authority over, you would have to go to your state's building code council to figure that out, because there's a pretty wide range of differentiations among different states. So now that we know what building codes are and how they are developed or adopted, let's take a look at why we should have EB readiness in building codes. But before we dive into that, let's figure out what is EB readiness. So in this graph, on the left-hand side with the red underlining here, we can see EB readiness is highlighted over here on the left-hand side as the part where we bring electricity from the electrical grid to the parking spaces on the right-hand side to a NEMA 1450 outlet, if you recognize that in the very middle of this entire graph. It requires electrical capacity in the electrical panel, and then conduit and raceway for the circuit to connect the panel to the outlet at the specific parking spaces. And at the very end of the right-hand side, you can see this outlet allows EV charging stations or the EV mobile chargers that come with the car to be plugged in and charge the vehicle that you intend to charge. In other words, it's like outfitting your local coffee shop's seats with the plugs that you need for your laptops. So you are outfitting your Starbucks with all the wirings and conduits needed to put plugs for your laptops at your seats. So when you're enjoying your coffee, you can also plug in your laptops. So the seats are laptop ready. It's a similar idea here. So after understanding what EV readiness is, let's bring back to why we are pursuing for electric transportation at the very first place. According to the International Energy Agency Global EV Outlook in 2017, it has mentioned that 23% of the global energy-related greenhouse gas is transportation related. And in the state of Washington, more than 40% of greenhouse gas emission is actually transportation related. So in order to combat climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emission, cities, states, and even nations have incorporated electric transportation into their climate action plans. And in the United States, many states have set very ambitious goals, such as in the states of California, it has required to have 5 million zero emission vehicles on the road by 2030 and enough charging infrastructure to support 1 million of these zero emission vehicles by 2020. In the state of Oregon, 50,000 registration of EVs by 2020 has been set out as a goal by the governor in Oregon. And even in the Midwest states like Illinois, it requires 15% of new state-owned vehicles to be fully electric by 2025. So as we can see, EV as an important part of the overall plan to cut down greenhouse gas emission, we need to figure out how do we achieve EV adoption by the general wide range consumers. And the factors that could influence the consumers' adoption of EV could vary such as offerings of car models could impact that decision, range and performance of the vehicle, price and cost of the ownership and operation could all impact the consumer's adoption decision. But the most important of all, as quoted here from the same report of IEA 2017 EV Outlook, is that the availability of charger emerged as one of the key factors for contributing to the market penetration of EVs. In other words, if we can put EV readiness in there, it will into the new buildings. EV readiness can remove the barriers to get behind the wheels of an EV because everyone will be able to plug in their electric vehicles and charge their EVs now, just like they do with their smartphones and laptops, which is going to make this adoption much more appealing and much more convenient for the consumers. So now I have established that EV adoption is important for greenhouse gas emission reduction, and the availability of charging is very important for EV adoption. Let's talk about why do we care about building codes for EV readiness. So first, and the most important reason amongst all is that EV readiness in building codes can enable a much wider access to charging infrastructure. The most difficult barrier in EV adoption for many people who live in the cities is that at multi-unit dwellings such as apartment buildings, tenants have a substantial barrier to install their own EV charging stations because of the agent principal problem that they face all the time with their landlord or their management team that are unwilling to make this kind of investments. And EV readiness in the building code will allow all these buildings to have all the needed infrastructure to put in to be put in the very first place. So every consumers who might consider EV could think about that they can just plug in their chargers for their car as easy as they do with plugging in their own laptops or smartphones. Plug and play. All they need to do is plug in either the mobile charger that comes with the car or go to Home Depot and buy a level 2 charger and plug it in. Secondly, EV readiness building code could complete the full offering of charging infrastructure with the existing workplace and public charging. Indeed, we have recognized that there are more commercial charging stations now out there, and more companies are providing workplace charging as a benefit to their employees, but that's not enough. EV readiness at residential, especially in multi-unit dwellings, will give consumers the most peace of mind about charging availability, not to mention the potential grid benefits of a flexible demand on the grid from the charging activities for the electric utilities. And then secondly, we see that EV readiness as a very good partner for the energy efficiency requirements today. Because in building codes today, there is already a very strong energy efficiency requirements built in there, which will free up a lot of electrical capacity for the buildings to accommodate for EV charging. And this combo is a very welcome sight because it could delay electrical upgrades both for the grid and for the building, and potentially incorporate on-site distributed energy resource as well. So it's a much more optimal combination of resources together. And last but not least, for the new buildings that are likely to be subject to the later or the newer EV building code, it is especially important to have EV readiness requirements because new buildings are going to last for decades. And it's better to ensure that infrastructure be installed at the beginning of the life of the building, comparing to retrofitting. And EV readiness is a technology neutral requirement that does not prescribe for any specific technology, but rather just an enabling requirement. We're not being prescriptive. We're not trying to play favors to any technology. We're just enabling this, like we're enabling every household to have a home plug to plug in their TVs or plug in their laptops. And finally, it is financially optimal to build an EV infrastructure compared to retrofitting. There are significant cost savings from avoided electrical upgrades, avoided drenching, avoided construction of conduits, and also there's avoided new permitting and inspection costs, because all of the related permitting or related inspection would have been done before the construction of the building. So there's a lot of cost savings that could come out of the EV readiness requirements. And here is a comparison of case studies done in San Francisco and Oakland, where it shows substantial cost savings comparing retrofitting to EV readiness requirements, as demonstrated here. And also, there are quotes here from the 2019 report produced by the California Air Resource Board, indicating that on average, there's 7,000 to 8,000 per parking space savings, comparing the EV readiness to retrofitting EV infrastructure. And now I would like to yield the floor to our guest speakers from Energy Solution and California Electric Transportation Coalition to talk about recommendations on EV requirement building codes and co-adoption situations around the nation. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So this is Ed Pike with Energy Solutions, and thank you, Eric, for that fantastic introduction. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail, and as will Hannah Goldsmith, about some recommendations for EV infrastructure building codes. We also have on the line my colleague Cassie Quito from Energy Solutions as well. So a little bit about Energy Solutions. We are a mission-focused, employee-owned clean energy consulting firm. We aim to positively impact the environment through market-based, cost-effective energy, carbon, and water management solutions for our clients in the United States and Canada. And you can see we have offices located throughout the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about why to adopt EV infrastructure measures into building codes, to mostly just build a little more onto that wonderful introduction that Eric provided, give an overview of who's adopting these codes, and then we'll move into what to include in building codes, more specifically, some updates, and then we'll have time for question and answer at the end for all of the presenters. So diving into the cost barriers, as Eric has mentioned, lack of EV infrastructure is a critical barrier to EV adoption, and building codes can increase EV charging infrastructure by avoiding a variety of retrofit costs, including the electrical system upgrades, breaking and repair of hardscape, all kinds of soft costs, permitting, inspection, approvals through an HOA, landlord, and there's more beyond that as well. And just to kind of put a graphic on some of the data that Eric had showed earlier, a study that we conducted for the City of Oakland and that we've slightly updated here shows that there's really a huge difference as shown in the green section of these bars for having to retrofit as compared to the bluer bars down below showing the cost for new construction across a variety of different scenarios that we analyzed in our model. So really across the board, it holds true that having EV-ready buildings is far less costly than having to retrofit infrastructure later. And many jurisdictions have recognized that the EV infrastructure is a critical policy option. And I know there's a lot of different dots on this map, but I just want to highlight that the dark orange represents a jurisdiction with multifamily building codes. With the lighter yellow, they've adopted non-residential, and so most jurisdictions have adopted both of these. And some have also adopted single family, which is important as well, but it doesn't have quite as many barriers, for instance, for me to put a charger in my basement in the house, which I am fortunate to own, compared to, say, in a multifamily building where somebody's renting or owns a condo, or in workplace, the barriers are much higher. So it's really encouraging to see that there is wide adoption across the United States and in Canada at the state and local level, and we'll talk about some national codes in development as well. So now I want to go into more detail on what to include in building codes, ranging from not having any infrastructure, which of course is what we're trying to correct for, EV capable, and then EV ready, as Eric has already talked about these some of the details. And then I'll talk about a couple additional topics as well that can be addressed in EV infrastructure building codes. The first recommendation is to include EV-capable parking spaces so that you don't later have to do things like break open walls, rip up asphalt or concrete, build new trenches, rip out electrical panels, things that are very difficult to do later. So with EV-capable, it's kind of the entry level or the first level of infrastructure with electrical panel capacity, any conduits that would be required basically destroying concrete or walls or some kind of extensive renovation to access that areas later. And in some codes, they just require the full conduit all the way through to the outlet. And it really focuses on those costs that are highest to retrofit later while minimizing the upfront costs to the builder. The next step up is an EV-ready parking space, which has a full circuit. So as Eric was pointing out, it's like you can just plug in and charge your car, just like you can plug in and charge your laptop. And we would recommend installing that at least 10% of parking spaces during new construction. I think I omitted on the prior slide, we would recommend including 10% or 90% of the remaining spaces would be EV capable. So that would have a mix of full circuits, plug and play, ready to go right now for immediate demand. And then with EV capable spaces, those could be built out over time as EV adoption increases. Another topic to consider in building codes is to look at potential vehicle-to-grid integration, which has gotten a lot of attention in California and some other states, especially where there's a lot of solar installation and trying to time EV charging to take advantage of peak solar production. Some codes are beginning to require 50 amp electrical service, and in some cases, it's contingent on having spare capacity on the electrical panel. So let's say that a code is addressing a single family home. It could specify that in the case where there's enough space on the electrical panel to increase to 50 amps, that would be the circuit built out for that single family home instead of 40 amps. And then that will maximize the capacity of that circuit and increase the amount of, say, on-peak solar that could be taken up by the vehicle, or if and when we get to bidirectional flow, it would increase the amount of current that could flow back out of the vehicle. Another option is to authorize load management systems to share electrical panel capacity among multiple parking spaces. And that's currently explicitly authorized by the National Electric Code, but it might not be a topic that local inspectors and permitting staff are familiar with. So it is beneficial to address that in the building code as either actual code language or as an informational notation to explain that these load management systems are authorized so that, let's say there's one circuit with serving multiple parking spaces, that circuit can serve more parking spaces with load management, sharing the capacity among different chargers, as opposed to having one circuit and one charger. So you might have two or more chargers sharing a specific circuit, or it might be managed at the panel and then shared either sequentially or split up to charge cars at lower than full capacity as they share capacity at the same time. And the idea there is basically just to stretch capacity to serve more drivers. I also want to talk about existing buildings, which is an area that's getting more attention in building codes these days. Major alterations in the parking area and the building itself, electrical system upgrades, provide a great opportunity to add EV-ready infrastructure to a building, and may be appropriate to put in a full circuit, or let's say if the parking area is being renovated with no change to electrical, maybe it's just putting in conduit during that parking area renovation. But again, because buildings last typically 50 years or so. It's really important to take advantage of these opportunities to retrofit existing building stock to be able to support EV charging. And some of the examples are the city and county of San Francisco and Marin County, also in San Francisco, where they already have EV infrastructure building codes that cover existing buildings. And there are quite a few jurisdictions that are looking to copy those models or come up with their own version to cover existing buildings as well. I also want to talk about accessibility. And in California, there's very specific rules about accessibility, but they don't apply when the building is constructed. If there's no EV chargers installed, they would only apply later when the EV charger is installed. And that creates a barrier because the parking lots could be designed with really nice electric vehicle infrastructure, but if they're not designed thoughtfully in a way that could easily comply with accessibility rules, then it may not actually be legal to build out electric vehicle infrastructure in those parking spaces. And in California, there's very specific rules. In other jurisdictions, I think there's more general federal law that I won't go into that could apply. And these issues should be easily avoided in the design phase by simply avoiding having excessive slope or unnecessary barriers to travel for those spaces that would be made available to folks with an accessibility need. So the building code can just specify good design practices, and then other requirements such as painting a wider stall could be addressed later at the time when EV chargers are installed. But at least the basic physical constraints could be addressed through good design when the building is first constructed. I also want to talk about some other types of building codes, and this is an area that hasn't gotten as much attention, but with so many states and national goals and local goals for electric buses, for electric transportation, that there's really an opportunity to consider building codes for a wide range of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to facilitate the transition to these other forms of electric transportation. Now, I'm glad that Hannah Goldsmith is on the line, and I'd like to ask her to give an update on CalGreen.
Sure, thanks, Ed. And I think Eric and Ed have done a really great job outlining why building codes, including measures for EV-ready or EV-capable parking spaces, are really important, and some of the provisions that those measures should include. On this slide, you can see a list of some studies as well as action plans that recommend adopting EV-ready or EV-capable code measures for many of the reasons that were already outlined today. And Energy Solutions, actually, Ed has done a lot of work on this as well and is extremely knowledgeable about all of the different jurisdictions that have these provisions in effect, as well as a lot of modeling to show how cost-effective it is and other things. And so there's also a pretty impressive, I would say, list here of stakeholders that have supported CalGreen, which is the California Green Building Code, which includes both mandatory and voluntary measures for EV capability for new construction in California. And so all of these organizations are supportive of that. There have been a number of cycles in California adopting and increasing the readiness or the capability requirements that are on the books. And then maybe I think the next slide has, thank you. And so currently in California, the California Green Building Code has mandatory requirements for residential construction, which includes 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhouses with attached private garages. It also has mandatory measures for multifamily, which is units beyond the 1- and 2-family dwellings, we have mandatory measures for non-residential as well. And so there are different percentages that are required at the state level for mandatory EV capability. So for 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhouses, those look new. It's all for new construction so far, and then I'll get into what we're looking at for existing construction for the next code cycle. But for new construction, 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhouses have to have certain EV capability support for the future installation of EV charging infrastructure like panel capacity and raceway for one spot. And then for multifamily, the law on the books right now is that when there are 17 or more units, then 3% of the parking spaces must be EV capable, but no less than one space. And this was actually amended in January of 2019 this year, which will be effective January 2021. So the multifamily requirements for mandatory were increased to 10% for EV-capable spaces, and that 17-space threshold was also removed. And then, in addition, in the January 2019 adoption, California adopted requirements for schools and community colleges to align with our non-residential requirements for new construction. And for non-residential, the mandatory requirements are at about 6% of total. There's a chart that determines, based on how many parking spaces are provided, how many EV spaces are required, but it's about 6%. And then for voluntary measures, and these are in Calgary, and the way that this generally works is that jurisdictions will make the voluntary measures mandatory in their jurisdiction if they want to go above and beyond the baseline that exists at the state code, and many jurisdictions, as Ed has mentioned, have even gone beyond the highest tier of what is required for voluntary EV capability in California. And so for multifamily, the voluntary measures currently are at 5%, but they were increased to 10 and 20%. There are two tiers. And then for non-residential, the voluntary measures are 8%. And so California is starting what is called the intervening code cycle, and it actually just began with a Building Standards Commission coordinating council meeting this month. And so that means that state agencies in California will start to submit proposed code changes. And during that meeting, we heard from the Building Standards Commission as well as the California Air Resources Board that they are looking to increase California's non-residential provisions for EV capability, which have not been increased in a longer amount of time than the multifamily, which was increased last year. And they also announced that they want to look at including requirements for existing buildings in California. And so now we will begin looking at kind of how to do that in a cost-effective way. And there are jurisdictions in California that have already done this, so I think it will be useful to look at lessons learned there. And I'll also highlight, kind of in addition to the folks that are on the previous slide in terms of studies, the California Air Resources Board has really been a leader in this field and has conducted a number of the analyses for the California state agencies that eventually propose and adopt the building code measures, and they have some information that folks can look at if you're interested. And I think as an advocacy organization, I would recommend, you know, if you're from a local jurisdiction or you're at the state level and your state has not, or your jurisdiction has not looked to adopt building code measures to ensure that, at least for new construction, that buildings are built to accommodate the future installation of EV chargers, I would very much encourage you to get on that. This is kind of a, I would say, quote, easy way to really help advance the EV market and ensure that there's going to be enough EV charging infrastructure without actually kind of spending money, I guess, in one way. The costs to put in the supportive infrastructure for future installation of EV chargers is very inexpensive during new construction and potentially during certain situations for existing construction when that building is being altered or retrofitted. And I'll say that California also has provisions for hotels and motels, and there are a number of other types of buildings that we'll be looking at too, and medium and heavy duty, which I think will be pretty interesting, as Ed mentioned. I think I didn't miss anything there, Ed.
That's great, thanks. Okay, so now that we've heard about the California update, I want to talk about some code proposals at the national level. And Eric gave a great overview earlier of how that cycle works and gets trickled down to the state level. So there's a current update for the national IECC building codes, and there will be a quiz on that acronym at the end, just kidding. And for the non-residential code proposal, it recently passed through an IEC committee with many supporters, as you can see on this slide, a very broad base of support. And it would require 1 to 2 EV-ready spaces, and in addition, roughly 20% EV-capable spaces for buildings with 11 or more parking spaces. And one interesting note about the building codes is that the non-residential code includes high-rise multifamily buildings. So that would include multifamily buildings above 3 stories will be included by this code, and it's not final yet, but it has gone through a key committee. There will be a public comment period, and there will be opportunities for anyone on the line who, if you don't see your organization on this list, please do reach out, and you're interested, please do reach out to me, because it will be very important to support this code through the final adoption process later this year. And there was also a residential proposal. Both of these were spearheaded by SWEEP, and it did not pass through the IECC committee. And it can be reconsidered based on public comments outside of the committee process. So again, if that's something that your organization could support, please do reach out and we can coordinate on the public comment process to try to resurface the national code proposal for residential buildings. That would cover single family and then the smaller multifamily buildings that are 3 stories or less. And are not covered by the non-residential code proposal. So there's definitely a very exciting opportunity to join a lot of very progressive and influential organizations in getting at least one of these codes through, and hopefully getting both of these codes through to help those agencies that just don't have the bandwidth or capacity to write their own local building codes. So speaking of barriers to adopting building codes, I just want to point out that for folks who work on building code adoption or might want to engage with their local agencies and officials, that there are certain barriers that commonly come up when trying to move these forward, such as lack of familiarity with EV infrastructure codes, where in California, state level, there's a lot of familiarity. Some of the larger cities, a lot of familiarity. But in a lot of jurisdictions, it's just not something that they have familiarity with. They might not have familiarity with model codes, cost-effectiveness data, or technical resources. And their key stakeholders might lack awareness about these types of opportunities. And it's great for FORTH to hold webinars such as this to help raise that awareness, so really appreciate that. And I also want to point out that while there are these barriers that folks might encounter to code adoption, there's also a lot of resources available to help move the process forward, especially with so many agencies having gone through this process already. There's a good, I'd say, library of resources, such as outreach presentations, model building codes, example building codes, cost-effectiveness reports. We've also done a permitting and inspection streamlining report. We've prepared a lot of these resources, and typically we're doing those for public agencies, and they're all free to everyone. There's other agencies or organizations that have worked on this as well. So I guess my key message is that if you are able to work towards these getting these codes adopted, then please do reach out. Feel free to reach out to me, and we'll have contact information both at the end of the Energy Solutions slide deck and also at the end of this presentation. And I'd be happy to share those with you. So in conclusion, I just want to recap that EV infrastructure building codes are highly cost effective. They are very effective at supporting expansion of the electric vehicle fleet, and that all the stakeholders on this call can really play a critical role in helping to make that happen, both in terms of, as we mentioned, the national code adoption process, state adoption code process like CalGreen, and many other states are also considering local codes, state level codes, as well as local code adoption, engaging with those key policymakers and getting them on board to move forward. In a lot of jurisdictions, it just takes that one critical policymaker who can make it all happen, and with some engagement from advocates. And as you've seen before, there's a lot of advocates who want to help. And I would also encourage consideration of some of the advanced building code options. Obviously, it might not be possible to cover everything the first time through, but I would say there are definitely some useful topics to cover, such as existing buildings, making sure that there's some simple language about good design practices to avoid creating unnecessary obstacles for accessibility. So thanks very much for your time and attention. And I think we're ready to move on to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ed, for your presentation, and thank you, Anna, for joining us, as well as Eric. The first question, please feel free to ask all your questions through the attendee chat, and we will go through them as we see them. The first question is for Hannah. Can you go over the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 voluntary measures?
Sure. Hi, this is Hannah. So in CalGreen, there's the baseline, which it sounds like you already got, which is mandatory across the state for building codes, and then Tier 1 and Tier 2 are varying levels of increased green measures. So CalGreen includes more than EV-capable measures, as you probably guessed. It also includes energy efficiency measures and other things. And so Tier 1 is kind of between the baseline mandatory, and then Tier 1 is between baseline and Tier 2. Basically, Tier 1 and Tier 2 are two options where, with Tier 2 being the most kind of ideal greenness, and jurisdictions in California have authority to adopt either of those tiers, whichever one they deem appropriate for their jurisdiction, or they can even go beyond them. They just have to get approval to do so. For example, if they're doing energy efficiency measures, they get approval from the California Energy Commission. I'm actually not sure what the process is for EV-capable measures. Ed might know.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Our next question is, unfortunately, we do not have the ability to implement local building codes in Minnesota. It must come from the state building code, and which comes from the national building code. What efforts are being done to affect the current round of codes? Any code updates, if any?
Hi, this is Ed. Let me jump in, and I think that was actually a great lead-in from earlier during the presentation. And so I think that the IEC code update is a great opportunity to support that. Many states have the ability to make revisions when they adopt the IECC. That is fairly common. And the other thing which I should have mentioned earlier is that actually this is not only limited to one state or city, but this commonly comes up either there may be practical barriers to adopting building code revisions at a specific point in time, or it may just be easier to accomplish the same thing through other mechanisms such as zoning requirements, parking codes, planning requirements. So I do want to point out that there are a lot of levers available to local governments, even if they can't adopt a building code amendment. And we've been tracking all of the different kinds of code adoption throughout the US and Canada, throughout whichever mechanism it's been. So we're happy to talk more about, offline and follow up about examples of any of those other options that might be available to a local jurisdiction that can't call it a building code, but could adopt it as maybe a planning requirement or zoning requirement.
Yeah, and this is Eric. I also want to just jump in to provide an example locally for me here in Seattle, which is a recent adoption of the city's ordinance. That's a new requirement on the zoning, on the land use codes that's requiring EV readiness. So that's just one example that there are multiple routes or multiple pathways towards achieving EV readiness, other than building codes, if building codes presents itself to be a very difficult part in your specific states due to the jurisdiction authority.
Thank you so much. So we have a quick follow-up for Hannah. Just for clarification's sake, is the difference between Tier 1 and 2 just the increase of the percentage of parking space, or is there no difference between EV capable and EV ready in CalGreen? And are all the requirements the same for EV capable spaces? If you could just clarify that, Anna.
Yeah, that's a good question. And sorry, I didn't go into more detail on the requirements. So they're different for the different levels of the different sectors of construction. So maybe as an example, I'll use the multifamily. So the current law in California for multifamily in the Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that they both require 5% of spaces to be EV capable instead of 3%. But this was amended, and I think this is a good example, this past January. So Tier 1 now increases from 5% to 15%, and then Tier 2 increases from 5% to 20%. And this also includes the installation of at least one charging station in the Tier 2 level. And one of the things that our Air Resources Board has recommended is that these voluntary provisions be transitioned to mandatory within the next 2 code cycles to meet our need to accelerate EVs. So California currently does not, I believe, require the EV readiness that goes beyond EV capability, but I think it's something that we're looking into for future code cycles. And there's some authority issues in statute for California with regard to whether at the state level you can require kind of beyond the infrastructure to support the future installation of charging stations for the mandatory code, maybe not so much for the voluntary, but that is not an issue, I think, for cities in California that can go beyond that. So hopefully that helps. There's a number of kind of nuances here. I don't want to maybe get in too much detail. I'm happy to chat with anyone if you have more detailed questions.
Thank you so much, Hannah. If there are no further questions, I would like to, one more question. Are the examples of California cities that have implemented the ordinance are the examples of California cities that have implemented ordinances that have EV capable requirements? And this is open to Hannah and anyone that wants to answer that.
Maybe I'll defer to Ed there. I know you have more familiarity with the local codes than I do.
Sure. So I'll just give one example, and we worked with the cities of Oakland, Fremont, and San Francisco to help them develop local codes. And they actually have a mix of EV-capable and EV-ready parking spaces, and I think that experience actually really helped us develop these recommendations so that there's that mix of you can plug in right now, and then you also have EV-capable for, between 10% more spaces or up to every other parking space in, say, a multifamily dwelling, so that you can expand out more easily in the future. So yes, there are definitely examples of California cities that have adopted EV-capable requirements.
Thank you so much for your questions. And with that, I would like to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, Eric, Ed, and Hannah, for a great presentation on strategies for EV-ready buildings and what the future holds. If you have any additional questions that we didn't get through today, we will have a follow-up email going out to everyone, and you could ask those questions and we'll get them answered. We are going to be taking a summer break as we prepare for Roadmap 12, which is happening June 18th through the 19th, but we will be back in August, and I look forward to joining you guys in August for another wonderful presentation. Just another thank you for our speakers and our attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us.